Hey everybody, welcome to the new month here on Patreon and YouTube. This month is all about autumn trees. Of course, being October, what else was a more perfect theme than studying those beautiful colors and nuances of fall? Today's project is about a 9 by 12. I have it taped off, so it might be a slightly smaller. Whenever you tape off a 9 by 12, you can always take it down to an 8 by 10 if you prefer. I have my photo up here, but make sure you watch your screen because it'll be popping up for you so you can follow along. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you enjoy. Let's get started. Okay, you guys, the first thing that I normally do standing at my easel is I like to make a mark at the middle. I eyeball that middle mark just to, remind myself that that's not where I want to put my focal point. And I'm also making some little hash marks on the sides to indicate the thirds. Of course, we've talked about the rule of thirds. What I'm doing right now is circling where those lines, if I was to draw them all the way across the paper, where those lines would intersect. The reason for that is just because those areas tend to be more dynamic in a composition. And if you want to, when you're drawing out your piece, making your thumbnail sketches, sketching on your paper, if you put the centers of interest or, even just brighter spots of color, those are the areas that form a great composition. You don't have to put something of interest in every single area where those cross sections create those blocks of the thirds that we talked about. But it's just something that's nice to have in the back of your head for when you're planning your piece and when you're drawing it out, that those are some great areas for areas of focus in your piece. I have been sketching out my major large shapes and my horizons with just a regular graphite pencil. You don't have to worry about the graphite, it melts into the paper. I'm using a spruce blue hard new pastel here, and I'm blocking in using the side of the pastel, not necessarily of what right there. I'm using the tip, drawing, pushing up to create some branches. Of course, in this reference photo, you can see that this is actually, for those of you that aren't familiar with the term Playa Lake, a playa lake is a type of lake where I live that fills and drains or evaporates with water. There's basically small indentions throughout our very flat land that fill and then evaporate. And so there are a lot of trees that grow towards the playa lake. These are cottonwood trees. And usually they're not in water because the playas don't always fill all the way up to the brim. In this case, we had had a ton of rain and the playa filled, and so there was water all the way over the roots of this tree, and the beautiful reflections of this tree caught my eye. And so I actually pulled over on an access road off of the highway to take some of these pictures. I've used two colors of blue, blue hard new pastel to swipe in the major large shapes in those shadow areas. And now I'm using my fan brush, my favorite fan brush, and just pushing some rubbing alcohol, also called surgical spirits, to create a wash of this new pastel. I love the fan brush because I can create different effects with it. I can flick it around, I can push up, as you can see I'm doing there. And it, the bristles really splay out to help you with those very organic textures that are within a tree. We don't have to necessarily draw all of them this way when they're already present because we've used a brush. You can see I'm using a liberal amount of alcohol and I'm allowing it to drip down. That also creates some fun texture. With pastels, we don't have the benefit of being able to apply thick paint to create texture. So we have to get it however we can. Right now, I'm re-establishing those that dark base of that tree is, you know, reflected in that water at the bottom. And you'll notice that how I applied the new pastel, the rubbing alcohol, is dependent on what object it is I'm painting. At the bottom, where it's a reflection, I pulled straight down, and then I also went across in a horizontal fashion. Up in the tree, I was much more organic and pushed it all around in different ways, up and down and side to side. And that just helps because that's, you know, that's the way in nature that those things are represented. The paper is still wet here, and so this new pastel that I'm putting in, you know, those really you know, fine, more branchy lines, they smooth in so easily. You don't have to push very hard. And I like to, you know, go right back in with rubbing alcohol because generally, you know, a tree, you can't see an entire branch or an entire twig off of a branch. You can only see parts of it because there are leaves in and around it. And so going back in with the rubbing alcohol almost washes some of those lines back into the paper and makes them a little softer, those soft edges that we all love so much. I'm also going to go back and, you know, work on a little bit of those trees way off in the distance. And then there is also a shoreline. You can see that I'm pulling it straight down to indicate more water. And now we're going to go, of course, the magic of video, the paper's already dry, and I'm going to start on the dry pastel layers. Now, through our series in the next 2 months, as we're studying autumn trees, we're going to approach them in various ways. The one we're doing, of course, today is starting off with my normal blue underpaintings and then applying the warmer tones of autumn on top. We'll also talk about ink underpaintings. We'll talk about warmer underpaintings instead of these dark blue colors. One thing in choosing your underpaintings is you have to think ahead. What is the goal of this piece? Because when you're using, like in this case, I used blue and I'm going to be applying these much warmer colors opposite of the color wheel. This is naturally going to make a more dynamic, vibrant piece because we're using complements of each other. Okay, you'll notice that I applied those darker ochre, reddish ochre colors, of course, because those are going to be the shadow colors of this painting. I'm also applying, you're thinking, what in the world? Well, Playa lakes are inherently pretty brown because they're really not very deep. And so, and they're also very silty. They're full of clay soil, which is what we have here. And so they always have a tinge of brown. And brown water, you know me, I don't love to paint brown water. But there are some really pretty reflections in this reference photo that we're going to be painting. And so I do want to start with a darker base, and I am just pulling that to blend those colors so they look like they're behind the tree. At this point, I am pushing them into the tree, and that way I can paint over them, and that brown color, which we're going to be altering, will look like it's behind the tree. I don't want to make a halo effect and try to protect all that blue. Those areas I'm going to cover. I have plenty of tooth there, and so that's why I did that. And just like when I'm painting my more warm, deciduous, very green trees, I just have a method that I like to use, and to me it just becomes very rote, and that is working from dark to light in value. And so you notice that I worked, of course, the blue new pastel is more just a blocking in shape right now, but that base dark blue that I swiped in where the twigs and branches are, that's my darkest. And then I moved into those reddish ochres, moving to a more warm, natural orange, then working even warmer into some yellows. And we're just going to move up the tree where the light would be and create this beautiful autumn scene. I'm going to really make an effort to make this a very impressionistic, almost a chunky scene. I love, those hard, fun marks that you can create with pastels. And so we'll be working back and forth quite a bit on this tree and in the water reflections in and around it and in the sky. There's also that little spit of land that's right there on the right hand side. Now you'll notice in the reference photo there's some dead leaves that are floating in the water, and there's a lot of a lighter area that would be, to me, very difficult to paint. I also want to increase the amount of blue reflection in the water, and so I'm not going to paint all those dead and fallen leaves at the base of the tree because I think that that would take away from the focal point, which to me is going to be the reflections and this beautiful golden tree. And so those are some ways that you can alter your reference photos. Really look at them and say, what is the main story here? And the main story to me is this beautiful yellow tree against the blue sky. And of course I will, being me, I hardly ever paint just a plain blue sky. I love to add clouds. I like to make a warmer sky, especially if there's warm light. And so that's what we'll be doing today. You'll notice I added some brighter greens over that brown, indicating that one left-hand side tree that's sticking out over the water. That's what I was talking about, how I pulled that brown underpainting over the blue tree, and that just makes it look like, that's just an easier way to put things behind a tree. Is don't be afraid to go over your underpainting, because you can always, because you have a lot of tooth left, you can always go back over it. I'm also starting to add in some blues. I, love to cut in the blue, especially this is gonna be really vibrant because we're gonna add a lot of yellow, and those blues and yellows together, it just adds such a punch of beautiful color. And so this is gonna be a fun painting to put together. I generally paint in two directions on water. One is going straight down, as I'm doing now. I'm going, perpendicular to the base, to the horizon line. Sorry, couldn't figure out the word there. And then I also go across, and those two marks really create that plane that we need for water, because water is not only reflective and things come towards us as we're looking at them, but it also is flat, and so it goes across. And so those two marks are going to help you always indicate water. I'm also adding in some warmth to the sky, and then I'm pushing that in with some pipe foam that I got at my local hardware store. That's a technique that I use often. And then I'm also putting in, just scumbling in, some very cool green. That's a Terry Ludwig green that I just used, over those blues that I had put in with the underpainting. I didn't really try to work to cover it up, once again using a really light touch, and that way those blues still show through a little bit, which marries the distant trees with this foreground tree. You'll notice I'm making pretty chunky marks, and I'm going to zoom in here so you can see my marks. With any type of tree that I am wanting to paint, you'll notice that I start off with a broader shape, and then I gradually work lighter in value, making smaller and smaller marks. So that is my way of defining and refining that shape, and also to indicate leaves, little leaves that are sticking out. I love that look. And so that's something that, that's how I approach the process of painting a tree. Of course, I like to skip around to different areas, especially if, I call it am I happy enough with this phase of whatever it is I'm painting? Right now, I figured I need to add some foreground. I need to add this so I can start figuring out the color. And you may be thinking, well, didn't you already figure out the color because you're painting with a color? But sometimes I like to create almost a base color. It's the same thing as underpainting, but thinking of it as more base painting or underpainting with the pastels. And sometimes what I'll do is I'll put it in and then I'll brush it it off, which the brushing off effect and technique actually still leaves the paper stained. You're just not having to do it wet. So you'll see me do that in a second because it's a little chunky down. I know I said I wanted a chunky painting, but I want that mainly in the tree and in the water. And so I want the areas of that foreground little spit of land to be a little softer. And so I just put in some color. I'm thinking about it in my mind. I'm always trying to figure out color. And so if for some reason, you know, something about the piece is causing me to think, what do I do now? I'll put down a color and I'll be thinking about it kind of in the back of my head, looking at it through almost unfocused eyes, stepping back, really squinting down to see, is this the right color? What do I do next? How can I fix the problem? I hope that makes sense to you. You know, it's just a quirk of mine to put something down and then you know, that's really when I'm thinking. And often with these videos that I paint for you guys, this is, you know, the first time I've ever painted it. This isn't like my live stream where I have practiced the piece. And that just works for me efficiently in my studio, and also just really shows you the working raw method of how an artist works. There are ebbs and flows, backwards, forwards, constant reevaluations of a painting, and that's how so many artists work. I'm still applying some warmer, very, very warm yellows. This is a very favorite of mine, a Townsend pastel. I love the Townsend pastels for their ability to almost scratch through to that hard surface because they have pumice in them, and so they really lay down a lot of pigment. I also put in some blue, but you'll see I didn't fill in the entire thing because I'm still thinking about it. I'm thinking in my head, do I want any yellow in the sky? Do I want there to be yellow clouds? Do I want to fill in the whole sky with blue? How do I want to do that? And so by adding a little bit of color in a very soft way, it's allowing me to solve, like I said, to solve the problem, to think about it. I'm also going back in with the same new pastel that I used to create some more of those branchy lines using that very, very soft touch. I also want to bring in a little bit of blue over into that tree. Just because there's so much blue in the water and there's going to be blue in the sky, I want to bring in a little bit of dark blue into those shadows. Now I know I'm going all over the place. You're all like, slow down. Right now I'm applying some white. This is also a Townsend. I decided I really wanted some white creamy clouds in, you know, with this underpainting showing through, that's just warming it up, but I wanted a lighter background behind this tree. And so I'm applying that in using a really soft light touch. Also, whenever I, you know, pulling some of that white over into the tree to indicate, yes, there are clouds going off in the distance, but then I tap, tap, tap that edge, even tap, tap, tapping that distant horizon line. That just softens that line to where it's not so harsh, and it, you know, creates that soft edge. We're going to have a lot of hard edges in this tree, and so I want to vary my edges throughout this piece. And I am going to be using bolder, harder marks in this painting, but I still want there to be a variety of edges. There are a lot of grasses that are growing in the water just because it's a Playa lake. You know, there are grasses at the bottom that are peeking up above the water, and so those brown marks, those are what I'm using to indicate that. But then I'm also right here going to pull in. This is just a brown new pastel just to add a little bit of that flavor. And then you can see I'm also using it in a sideways motion, using the lines of that new pastel to create some reflections. And then going back in with the blues that I have in the sky, back into the tree and making marks around those brown areas to show water reflection. Now I just made some marks of that light blue, and what I realized was like that's too light of a value. We want a darker value at the base of this tree because these areas are in shadow, and so you have to pull back in some darker blue. You can see that I am using, like I said, those horizontal and vertical marks, and then also pulling right back in this, more sketchy, harder. This is actually a piece of charcoal here, just to indicate that dark, deep shadow. Really making those chunky marks sideways and up and down to indicate, how the water is peeking out from underneath and around this tree. Now, what I wanted to do is still indicate that there is a lot of reflection. And so I put some green down into that water, also putting a little bit of green up into the tree. And that way, there's so much green in the foreground and in the distance. That way, it's the same thing. You're using a little bit of color in a lot of different areas that is a similar temperature. And that way, all of those things have a consistent vibe going on. And once again, I'm moving even lighter. So this is a lighter green, and I'm making those little small chunky marks that I mentioned, showing how there are little leaves that are catching the light, especially in autumn. Those leaves can really catch the light. Now remember how I said sometimes I'll put in some pastel and then actually brush it off, and that just keeps a ghost image of that color, and that's exactly what I'm doing here. You'll see that I'm brushing it off a little bit and then going back over it, and yet that color still remains. That's just because of the benefits of sanded paper. But I wanted a smoother look at the bottom. I knew I wanted that, that you can see in the photo, it's this dead kind of grass. I wanted mine to be a little bit more vibrant just because I love color so much. And so using that technique will help you just kind of create a base color that then you have, but you still have tooth. If you do that, just make sure that you have an air filtration system. Make sure you're not blowing on your pastels or knocking it off into the air. Mine drops straight down into the tray below my painting, and so I have minimal dust in my studio. I'm adding in some different greens. This is a Rembrandt. I love Rembrandts for grasses. I think it's one of my very favorites for grasses. Not only are they one of the more inexpensive brands, but they have just a perfect hardness for really scratching in and either lying down a lot of pastel if you're pushing hard, or just a slight glaze. And you can really, I love to hold them between my fingers and almost just run the length of the pastel up, and that indicates these beautiful grasses. Okay, I want to add some more blues, and you'll see that I'm cutting some of the blue that's reflecting, that's underneath this, into those grassy areas. I'm going in and around, making kind of chunky marks around, even where the trunks of these trees are, carving out grasses, carving out twigs, carving out little branches. This is a fun technique to use. This negative painting is, thinking of it as, this is my block of marble, and I'm going to carve out this autumn tree and these grasses on this shoreline of this Playa lake. It creates, kind of unique effects. When you go back and forth between, regular mark making where you're, drawing the item versus carving out the item, you have variety in your marks, which create a really impactful piece. In order to be cohesive, I want to add a little bit of a hint of gold back there on those distant trees that I had painted earlier. So I just, added a touch, just a really light scumble effect. I'm also adding in some more greens here. This is another Townsend. I tell you, I love them. I wish I had a full set. And just, because there's so much green in the foreground, I want to bridge those colors together. And often in autumn, we have, there are parts of the tree that have changed. There are parts of the tree that haven't. And so this is a great way to add variety to your color temperature in your autumn scenes. Going right back in, this is this is a color I've used in many videos, especially in Skies and Water. This is that Great American beacon that I love so much. It's just the perfect blue. It's not too cobalt. It's not too ultramarine. It's not turquoise. It's just a beautiful color. And I'm just really stepping back here and looking at the reflections and how to carve out, how to carve out this look in this painting. One thing I notice is, I really think I want to add a little bit of that same color, that same beacon, Great American, way up into that top of the sky. And that way those colors, that way it makes more sense where you're thinking, okay, well, there's also sky over this tree. And so those colors would be reflecting straight down. And so that's one way that I achieve that, is just, making sure there's hints of the same colors. I'm also wanting to put a little bit of white into the water because there are clouds. And so those would also be reflecting. You don't have to draw a cloud to indicate a cloud. You just have to add a hint, a touch of that same color, and that will tell the viewer what it is. Now, there are many times where I could stop. I could stop painting. I could, hold back. I was having so much fun with this piece. I just kept going. And, that's one of the hardest things. I know that you feel this way. I've gotten so many comments about how do you know when you're finished? And you just kind of know. I'm stepping back. This is actually the part of the piece where I'm slowing down, I'm stepping back, I'm squinting my eyes. What does the piece need? How is it going? How is it coming together in a cohesive style? How are the edges? How are the shadows? How is the value range? What do I like about it? What do I not like about it? What areas of the piece are working and what aren't? Those are always good questions to ask yourself, and you can see that I am slowing down here a little bit. I'm also, that I added some cool greens into that foreground. I'm also just glazing a little bit over some of the very bright areas of this piece just to knock them down a little bit. I'm really looking at, the water here to make sure that the reflections make sense. And, really just looking at all of it as a cohesive painting to see areas that can be worked on or areas that just maybe one more mark might just really help it pop and shine. For instance, one of the things I don't like about the sky is my sky hole where, there's blue sky showing looks like a heart. That's a really, that might be a great fine shape for clouds, but it's distracting. And so I need to refine it. Those are always things I'm looking at. I'm evaluating, I'm looking at shapes in clouds, I'm looking at shapes in trees, I'm looking at shapes in the reflections, and really editing and being, having a critique for myself, but not in a way that is unkind, like this painting's terrible, you're never going to paint another pretty piece ever again, which is something I've told myself on many occasions. My husband will come home and I've had a bad painting day and I'm stomping around the house and is everything okay? And I'm like, nope, I can't paint, I forgot how, I don't know what I'm doing. Oh, and then he just pats my arm and says, it'll be okay, honey, you'll be fine. And inevitably, I am. You just have to sometimes break through, right? So here I'm just altering the sky shape a little bit, bringing in very soft. You can see how softly I'm glazing that blue down into the horizon line. I made the horizon line a little harder, and then I'm also pulling some of that blue into the tree just to break it up a little bit. Something I like to think about is I don't want my tree to suffocate. And so I'll add some sky holes, and then you'll see here I soften them a little bit, sometimes with my fingers, sometimes with a brush. Any areas that I see, this area needs maybe some more detail. I want to push whatever color is on it back. I want to push it back. You can, use brushes, use your fingers, gently glaze. You're not, or gently glide that pastel off. You're not rubbing it in and mixing those pigments together. You're revealing pigment. Now I'm going back in, I'm going to lighten this one area. You'll see in the reference photo that there's kind of this branching area kind of in the middle that kind of branches over and around that where it's really catching the light. And I want to add some of that. I want to create more of that effect. And so I'm going to, one of the things I wanted to do is I want to bring some more autumn colors. I kind of lost a lot of that orange, and so let's get it back. Let's add some back. I also want to darken, you can see I'm pointing right there, I'm wanting to darken this area of the tree. That's something that kind of stood out to me that needed refining, is this area, those dark trunks would be, since I kind of made up the water in the foreground, instead of doing those dead leaves, I need to also make sure that it makes sense and that those dark trunks would be reflecting very dark onto that water. Now I'm going to be making some smaller, chunkier marks to indicate those little that branch, that's right there, that's coming forward. That's one way to make a tree look more 3D than 2D. Is you'll notice how that darker value that's behind where I'm marking now is it's softer. The areas that I'm painting now, I'm making much harder, more pointed marks. I'm not trying to draw every little branch, but I can paint those little tiny, those little marks. I'm almost rocking the pastel up onto its tip, not really using the tip, but using the front of that pastel to tap and push that pastel into the paper, which helps you indicate leaves. I also want to add some swirls down at the base, just to further, reiterate that this is water, in case somebody thought there was bluegrass down there, and just slightly, very slightly glazing. You guys, and that is it. I had so much fun painting this. I just didn't even want to stop painting it. I love to add this black tape. This is just black artist tape. It just helps, kind of course, refine the edges. You can look at it a little bit more as a matted piece, especially if you don't have a matted piece. And it just helps create just this pop and kapow value contrast. I loved painting this. I'm so excited to paint the entire next 2 months of autumn scenes, and I'm so glad you're here.